In this video, we're going to get into more of the nuts and bolts of how VTP actually operates on the wire before we jump into our lab and actually see how it works in reality. So first and foremost, VTP is configured in the switch global configuration mode. And this is true for most modern iOS switches. There are some older switches, even some older iOS switches, where you have to go into the VLAN database configuration mode to configure the VTP parameters. I actually have one of each type of switch in my lab, so I'll show you both ways of configuring VTP. However, in most modern switches, and in fact on the exam, the newer commands are what you'll be tested on. Now, by default, every switch is configured as a VTP server with a null domain name and a null password. Now, I know you might look at that statement and go, oh, holy goodness, I'm running VTP and I didn't even know it. Well, not really. VTP requires a domain name to send VTP updates. And this means by default that these switches don't send any VTP updates. If you were to go debug VTP, or you were to go hook up a Wireshark or some other protocol analyzer, you wouldn't see any VTP going across the wire because it's all null. Now it's sitting there primed and ready. All you have to do is configure a VTP domain name to start sending updates, and the server switch will start sending the update. And in fact, you only have to change it in one switch, and it will synchronize it out to all the rest of the switches. And we'll go through that process here on the next slide. Every time you modify the VLAN configuration on a switch, it increments the VTP revision number and sends a VTP update to its directly connected switches. So again, this isn't a layer 3 protocol. It's not using any kind of multicast or anything like that. It's actually just talking directly to its connected switches, just like CDP. Some of the best practices to remember around VTP. Normally, you'll only have one or two switches be the VTP servers and the rest are clients. This limits the places you can actually make configuration changes. And normally, you'd have your core switches be the servers and everything else be a client. Number 2, always set a VTP password. As you learn more about VTP, you'll see why that's important. If you're going to run VTP, and you're going to take that leap of faith that you're never going to mess your network up, always set password. I can't stress that enough. I've seen so many networks just cease to function because no one set a VTP password and somebody connected a switch where they shouldn't have and deleted all the VLANs. And again, we'll go through that a little later in this slide deck. Number 3, if you use VTP, be sure to enable VTP pruning, which really is one of the points of having VTP. And we'll talk about VTP pruning again a little later in this slide deck. So now let's delve a little bit more into the 3 VTP modes. And we talked about this in the overview, but we'll go into a little more detail here on this slide. The first is the server. An administrator can make changes to the VLAN database on this switch. Those changes are then sent to all of the directly connected switches. Those switches then update their database and send the update out to all of its switches and so on and so forth. So you can see how it could very quickly filter out to all of the client switches on your network. You then have a VTP client. On the VTP client, you can't make changes to the VLAN database. If you try to make changes, it'll actually come back and tell you, hey, I'm not a server, you can't make changes. Most administrators at that point don't bother go looking for the server. They just make it a server, make the change they want, and then put it back to being a client, which again is not really best practice, but if you're in a hurry, or especially if you're in a hurry, that's the best way to get the changes made. The third is a transparent mode, and you'll recall that we said the VTP update is ignored, and this is where the differences between version 1 and version 2 VTP come into play. If you're running version 1 VTP, the switch will drop the update unless the VTP domain matches the update, and then it will forward it to other connected switches. It still will not consume the update. I won't actually update my VLAN database with this update, but I will forward it to everybody else. If you're running VTP version 2, it will forward the VTP update regardless of the VTP domain name setting. And again, just like version 1, it will not consume that update. It will not update its local VLAN database, but it will propagate it out regardless of whatever domain that switch happens to be in. So you can see if you set a switch to transparent mode, it will pretty much just disable VTP. It'll still forward the updates, but it won't update its VLAN database. And this might be good for DMZ switches where your VLAN database and your VLAN numbers might be radically different than your internal network. You don't want that DMZ switch consuming the update and updating VLAN numbers and taking down your entire DMZ, so you'd set that switch to transparent. Now, it's important to realize that VTP updates can go from the client to the server just like it can go from the server to the client. And in fact, that is one of the failure scenarios we'll talk about here in a couple of slides. The server construct is simply there for security. Again, according to best practices, you would normally only have 1 or 2 VTP servers. Those VTP servers would be your core switches. So if you have your core switches set to be servers and you have everything else set to be clients, then normally you'd have your core switches secured so that your average administrator can't just log into those switches and make a VLAN modification. You'd also have security configured on the client so that they can't change the VTP mode on the client to a server just to get this change put in. So therefore you can control who gets to make updates using iOS security mechanisms. But make no mistake, if someone does somehow manage to update one of those clients with a higher VTP configuration revision number, it will overwrite what's in the server. And again, that's a failure scenario, and we'll talk about that here in a bit. We'll pick up with our in-depth discussion of VTP operation in the next video.